So without further ado, let's go into writing the self. Please join me in welcoming Ru Freeman, Ved Mehta, Joseph O'Neill, Philip Hensher, and William Sutcliffe. Thank you.
Are you married?
Yeah.
Well, I'm with
Hello. Thank you all for coming. I hope you can all. Can you not hear? Well, maybe the sound person need a moment longer to adjust it. Does the microphone need an adjustment? Okay. Is that better? Am I more audible now? No. Is that better now? Shall I hold it? Like that? Okay. Audible? Is that audible now? Can everybody hear now? Okay, I like this. We've got a debate going already. That's a good start. Now, I don't know if any of you were here for the non-fiction Renaissance session yesterday, but Jeff Dyer, in the course of that session, said something quite controversial. He's written memoir and fiction and non-fiction, and he said in the course of his writing, fiction and non-fiction, he's made up roughly the same proportion of made-up and non-made-up stuff in the fiction and the non-fiction. And all right. Okay, like that. Is that better?
I can barely hear you.
Is that okay?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me.
I can't hear you.
Should I start again? Was everything I said completely inaudible? I'll start again on the assumption that was inaudible. There was a session on non-fiction Renaissance yesterday, and Jeff Dyer in that session said that in his non-fiction and his fiction, there's roughly the same proportion of made-up elements and non-made-up elements. Anthony Beevor was sitting next to him at the time, who gave him a very severe frown at the notion of anything made up appearing in non-fiction. So I'm hoping in the course of this panel today we can tease away at that thread of the barrier between fiction and non-fiction, truth and untruth in memoir and non-fiction. I'm very pleased to be here with a panel of fascinating writers: Philip Hensher, Ru Freeman, Joseph O'Neill, and Ved Mehta. And three people principally known as novelists, and Ved principally known as a memoirist. And I think the question I'd like to throw open to the panel first is one thing that often is bothersome to novelists, is when you write a novel and you get interviewed about that novel, the question you always get, usually couched in some kind of disguise or other, you often get interviewed, and the subtext of many of the questions is, which bits of your novel are true? How much of it is true? Where do I find the true bits? So I'd like to throw that open to Philip first. How much do you hate that question, and why?
Well, I don't. That's not working at all, is it? Is it working? Yes. I don't hate the question at all. I think it's a very natural question that we pose all the time to our friends and say, did that really happen? Was that exactly it? How true is that? How much has it been filtered through your experience and what you noticed? And I rather like the question, even if it never produces an accurate answer. I would say, I'm a novelist. I don't really write memoirs, so I don't quite know what I'm doing here. But what I'm interested in as a novelist, rendering people's experiences, is the bits of experience that become important to them over time, the ways in which bits of experience get mangled into favourite stories, into exaggerated episodes, into extraordinary, fantastical reminiscences. These things become significant over time. I would say that the things that are truest in my books, or the closest to true experience, are the funny bits. And for me, there's nothing so authentically funny as things that really happened exactly like that. For some reason, it's impossible to invent a really funny episode. Before you know it, you're talking about the moment when somebody, somebody had their jam stolen by gypsies or something, and it doesn't ring true. But the things that ring true are the moments when you say exactly the wrong thing to exactly the wrong person. Those things seem to be kind of irreducible to me. So there is a core of truth, but whether you can get at it by saying to an author, what is true in this book, I don't really know.
And Ru, are you irked by the question, or like Philip, you're not bothered by it? You're happy for people to try and sort of turn fiction into non-fiction in a way by asking that question?
I'm happy that people are reading my books. So whether they, I'm kind of, oh, sorry. Happy that people are reading my books. So this little girl on the cover, that would be me. That's true. No. I think, yesterday there was a panel, three women, the Africas, and Tay Selassie was talking about the fact that we shouldn't have to write the things we've lived because we are not journalists or memoirists. And in some ways that is true, but at the same time, I do both. I do journalism as well as write fiction. And I think that for me, the more true thing, I think we would be, I'm talking about how we define what is true, is the fiction and not the journalism. Because the emotional truth of things that I'm trying to get at, I find in writing the fiction. And that is not necessarily based entirely on things happening exactly, reporting something that's happened exactly as it happened, or, portraying a character exactly as they lived that I've known, but rather trying to find an overall emotional truth to our larger human experience. And particularly for me, writing about Sri Lanka in a time of conflict, that's what I'm trying to do when I write.
So even though it's ostensibly fiction, you don't feel like you're fighting a misreading of the book when people are trying to tease out the truth from the untruth. You don't want it to be read as just fiction.
Well, I want it to be read as just fiction because I think people are more receptive to fiction than they are to a non-fiction piece. I'm sure some people on the panel may disagree. When they're reading a piece of journalism, then I think people are more apt to say, well, she's writing that because of this or that. But when we pick up a work of fiction, we are automatically disarmed. We are open to this being a fictional place, and so we are happy to inhabit a space that might not be comfortable for us in an ordinary, real world. And I think while we are doing that, we are more able to absorb a truth that comes through the fiction.
Joseph, would you agree with that? Do you find that you've conjured fiction that you find readers and interviewers wanting to interpret as fact?
Well, I agree with everything my panelists say. I do think I've written 3 novels and 1 non-fiction book, and I do think that there is a formal distinction between the two. I do think that if you label something fiction, no matter how much it might be rooted in your own life, you're inviting the reader to approach the text in a certain way. And you're effectively abolishing the connection between yourself and your life and the text. Whether or not the reader decides to accept that invitation is obviously up to the reader. But it does seem. I do think if I've written a novel and people say, well, is this autobiographical? I do feel slightly feel. I'm not. I do think that you've gone to the. It might be, but it's almost irrelevant. Now, of course, these days the distinction between fiction and non-fiction is becoming very interestingly blurred by certain writers, and so the whole kind of distinction. I'm talking about Zeebold, I'm talking about Knausgaard and others, who are. On the face of it, writing novels, but also at the same time, on the face of it, writing non-fiction, and so it's a pretty, it's getting to be a much more kind of complicated distinction these days.
And some people find themselves frustrated by that. I find that if I read Zeebold, I have a voice in my head wondering whether it's true or not, in a way, and I know that's sort of a stupid question. But because it's sort of sold as non-fiction, you feel like you're under some obligation to believe it as true. And I find that, are you, do you feel like it's correct to be wrong-footed by that?
Well, I mean, the whole point of writing fiction is to inaugurate a kind of truth which is not available in the normal world. You know, there are factual truths out there, there are journalistic truths, which are presented by journalism, by television, by everyday life. And the whole point of fiction, I think, is to kind of create a category of truth, which, as Ru said, you know, which wouldn't exist except for the novel or for the piece of fiction.
And now, Ved, you're known mainly as a memoirist. Now, we're talking about the blurring of lines here between fiction and non-fiction. When you're writing memoir, how strict with the truth are you? Do you feel that you're allowed to embellish to make a better story?
Who's he talking to? I'm sorry, I wasn't aware you were talking to me.
Oh, sorry.
I think when I'm writing something, whatever it is, if it calls for embellishment, I never think of the embellishment as kind of falsehood. I think of it as kind of getting at the greater truth. And that's not as difficult as it sounds, because I don't think there is any capital T anywhere. Truth is elusive, and it can be made beautiful by how you couch a true incident or element. And most of my time when I'm writing is spent not trying to find out exactly what happened, but actually trying to discover how could I make that exactly what happened come true on the page. And of course it's helpful if it's also true, but it's not the a priori condition of what I'm trying to say.
Can I throw that back at the rest of the panel? Do you think that as a reader, is there a different compact of trust that comes up when you're reading a book that is sold as a memoir? I mean, the most obvious example of that is the huge scandal that erupted around James Frey's memoir, A Million Little Pieces. I'm not sure whether that scandal broke in India. It was a very successful memoir. He was on Oprah, he sold a lot of books, and then he was exposed for having made stuff up. And you may think if there's this blurred line, people would have been able to shrug and say, okay, so it's a novel. But that was not the response. He was shamed, and there was a huge scandal. Why were people so upset?
I think there is a growing mistrust of the novel and of the creative imagination in the world today. We're surrounded by, you know, so much discourse that we want to find our way to the stony core of incontrovertible truth. Of course, there is no such thing as an incontrovertible truth, but the strange effect is that people start to value things in the novel that are really nothing to do with the novel at all. Not just in, you know, James Frey's case, but I think a very interesting case is Hilary Mantel's Tudor trilogy in the making, which makes a particular point of not making anything up. This is all exactly how it was. This can all be backed up from documentary sources, and people seem to like that. I always remember the moment when I was talking at a literary festival and about a novel that I'd written based in a small Devon village where I used to live, and there was a very old lady in the front row who was glowering at me the whole way through, and when it came to question time, she raised her hand and said, "All I can say is you've got a very vivid imagination." And I thought that was a simply extraordinary thing to accuse a novelist of having. So there is a mistrust, really, there.
But that's in terms of novel, that's an interesting sort of novelist response, saying you mistrust novelists for putting in too many facts. When sort of the question I was asking was, do you mistrust memoirists for putting in fiction? I mean, Joseph and Ru, how do you feel about the James Frey scandal? Do you think people were foolish to believe a memoir anyway?
To be honest, I haven't really thought too much about the James Frey scandal. I think people felt it was a sort of an enormous commercially successful book, and so it was a book that operated in many ways on the level of merchandise, and so that people felt betrayed, as consumers of facts, and so on that sense there was a misrepresentation of the goods in question, which was that it was supposedly sold to them as a kind of as factual goods when it was fictional goods. But obviously, anyone who's written non-fiction knows that. Extensive non-fiction, which doesn't purport to be historically kind of accurate and the rest of it, knows that has a less kind of idealistic view of what non-fiction involves. I think I respectfully agree with Ved when he says that. Obviously, you have to, you can't allow the level of veracity of any particular non-fiction book to get bogged down in all the little details and fact-checking and so forth. And when you're trying to, get at something maybe more interesting. And the other thing you're trying to do, of course, is work in language. And language generates its own truth, its own kind of truth, and the page, as Ved said, it's on the page. The page is its own area of truth, and so I would, if I'm reading what purports to be a sort of an autobiographical piece of writing, I'm always conscious that there are shortcuts being taken, things are being compressed, and incidents are being chronologically kind of squashed together to make the thing more palatable, I suppose.
But you're almost suggesting that there are two genres there of memoir. There's literary memoirists who can make things up, and mass market memoirists who are sort of betraying their audience if they're making something up. Do you think, because there's this whole separate genre of memoir, which is often sold as sort of misery memoir. James Frey, Angela's Ashes, Dave Peltzer, huge selling books. And if those people are making something up, they are letting down their audience in a way that Sobart's readers aren't. Why should there be that distinction? I wonder, Ved Mehta, do you have a thought on that? Do you think literary memoirists can embellish in a way that those mass market memoirists should not be allowed to?
I think we should banish the word memoir. I don't think anybody can remember exactly what happened at any time. I think more important is the verisimilitude. Now, for instance, I remember writing about how I lost my sight when I was about 4 years old. And it was enormous help to get a medical doctor on the telephone who told me how this fever might have developed and how it might have affected my optic nerves. These were factual stuff which I wouldn't have thought important, but I know since then that the factual content of that conversation helped me not only to write what happened to my sight, but also to reach what seemed to be a right kind of conclusion. Now, whether it was exactly that way, I don't know. But the truth is that my optic nerves were damaged during this fever. And it was really much more interesting to find out exactly what optic nerves were, where they are located, how they might have been damaged, and what, if anything, had been done by the doctor. These are the kind of factual elements that come into any kind of writing, and I think if you get it right, I think it helps the texture of the writing, and I think it also helps the reader to visualize what happened. So I'm not one of these people who says facts don't matter. I think facts matter enormously. In fact, more accurate a piece of writing is, the more powerful it is.
And I wonder if the three of you, when you read one of these best-selling memoirs, often tales of great suffering, do you believe what you're reading?
Well, I think go back to James Frey, and you also have to think about the editorial decision to call it a memoir versus non-fiction, versus fiction. or as a novel, there's a large role that the readership plays in wanting to know, to be able to say, oh my God, that terrible thing happened to you. It didn't happen to me, but I'm so, so horrified by it, which is why Misery Memoir is popular. But there is also the element of marketing a novel where the more non-fiction elements there are, the more marketable the fiction becomes. Because people also like to have that, to say, oh, this is actually lived experience now translated into fiction. But to go back to something that Joseph said about the truth of the page, the words on the page having its own truth, I think that is, I think it was yesterday during the discussion about the global novel, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this name, but Jean-Lu Gua, who spoke about her kind of frustration with the idea of fine literary prose on the page, because for someone like her, and certainly for someone like me, we are choosing to write fiction because we are trying to translate an experience that people may not be familiar with. So you're really trying to get certain factual elements right in the fiction, but also, like I said before, find that emotional truth that is a larger truth for people. And that, I think, the choice to focus on a truth on the page in terms of good literary writing, which is important, is maybe perhaps the prerogative of the privileged who have not undergone the circumstances that she did or I did.
I think that Ved hits on a very important point with his word verisimilitude, and for me there's an almost close identity between what is literally factually true and what has the strong appearance of truthfulness. And one of the point at which they overlap is that factual detail, that designation of the particular case, the actual optic nerves, the real construction of something. But sometimes it can just be detail, and sometimes it can just be the counterintuitive case. And I think when you're talking to people about something that might go into a piece of writing, you recognize the quality of truth. There's a particular example that I've got from my own writing. I wrote a novel about the Bangladesh War of Independence, and it was largely about the family experience of my husband's family, and he was born just before the Bangladesh War broke out, and his family was living with his grandfather, and his grandfather gave the instruction that the baby in the house, in other words, Zaved, had to be fed constantly to keep him from crying, because if the noise of the baby crying came out of the house, then the Pakistani troops would hear this noise. They would know there were young women in the house. They would break in, and atrocities would follow. So at the end of the Civil War, the family had this immensely fat baby who had been fed for 9 months by Mishti Doi. Now, with Mishti Doi, the thing is that is the sort of detail which I don't think you would ever come to. It has the specific it has the specific quality of verisimilitude. I don't actually know whether that's actually literally true or whether it's just something that Zaved told me. But it has the ring of truth about it to me because of the particular, maybe even counterintuitive case, the specific fact that goes against what we might assume, I think.
Yes, it's very true that in life you come across a story, and actually when you're reading a book, there are things that pop out of the page where you often think that's so strange it has to be true. I mean, it's interesting when we're talking about fiction and non-fiction. It's interesting, I think the word truthfulness that you said there is very interesting, that all writers on both sides of the genre are aiming at truthfulness, and that writers of fiction are aiming at it via making things up, and writers of memoir aiming at the same target via not making things up. I mean, I wonder if you, Joseph, do you feel like there's a similar sort of trigger that you're looking for in terms of verisimilitude, that we can draw a line between that and actual truth?
The word verisimilitude is one word, which is obviously a very good word in this context. Another word which I think is a good word is accuracy. Accuracy is not a, when you're reading, whether it's a non-fiction or fiction, you become very quickly aware as a reader of whether or not the text is pressured by accuracy. And accuracy, and you feel accuracy not by reference to the realm of factual data, although that can be the case. If someone's writing about the war in Bangladesh, for example, and there are sort of historical errors there, the pressure of accuracy which you look for in a text obviously evaporates. So there are obviously factual elements there. But accuracy essentially is accuracy in a text derives from the relationship between the writer and the work. You can sense this kind of conscientiousness in the text, and that gives rise to authority. And once you feel that authority of accuracy, which is a word which comes from the Latin word for care, when you sense that feeling of care has gone into writing, then you trust the text. And then you give yourself over to the possibility that the text might offer some truths which is not otherwise available.
I think there is such a thing as accuracy of spirit of what happened and what actually happened. And as a writer, I'm more concerned with spirit of what happened, i.e. it's plausible. It's very important to make something plausible. And once you make something plausible, then whether it is or not factually accurate, it will seem perfectly all right. This is not to give license to writers to write whatever they like. I just mean that as a reader, you know when something rings true or not true. And I think that's what I'm aiming at. But at the same time, I'm also very concerned with the facts. I shouldn't say that I lost my sight because my temperature was 99 degree point something. I should really actually say what happened, because often the truth is reality, if you really address it properly, is truer than anything you can make up. I couldn't make up a temperature that I should have had or I might have had. It's much better just to stay with what the temperature actually was, which burst my, I don't know, not burst is the right word, which damaged my optic nerve, which then left me totally blind for the rest of my life. I don't think you can just invent some temperature. It has to grow from the fact, from the event. It should be integral to it, and I think it will be more convincing to the reader and more plausible if I'm able to summon those facts.
But a memoirist, there's the real event, and then you're aiming towards that through your writing. A novelist, I'm sure all of you go through draft after draft of your book. Do you find that the difference between the first draft and the second draft and the finished draft is that the early drafts don't feel real enough, don't feel true enough? Is it the case that through subsequent drafts you're aiming towards further verisimilitude by adding in what?
I think I'm somebody who does a great deal of walking through a novel before writing any of it, and that's the key point to me, just to put myself in the position of each of the characters and think, would he have thought that? Would he have said that? Kingsley Amis said about Virginia Woolf that he read it with a voice in his head going, no, she didn't. No, he didn't. No, he wouldn't have said that. And I think that's harsh on Virginia Woolf. But there are moments in Virginia Woolf when I know what he means. And one of them is when Mrs. Ramsay serves the beurre en daube into the lighthouse. And she's just taking it, she's just looking at it as she serves it to her guests. And she's seized with a sort of ecstasy at the depths of meat. And I think that's really not what she would have thought. She would have thought, oh God, I hope it's not burnt. Is it all right? Did I remember to put the salt in? Is it, you're seized with worry at that point. If you have ecstasy over your own cooking, it's not evident at the moment of serving. So it's about an emotional truthfulness as well, I think. But when does that come into the writing process? I think if it comes in at a very late stage, then you're stuffed, really.
I mean, Ru, you were saying to me when we went on that there's a whole lecture. I mean, if you feel like you've written about Sri Lanka and you're aware that you're writing for an audience that don't necessarily know about Sri Lanka, so even in fiction, there's an element of reportage going on there. I mean, how do you feel about a sense of responsibility in terms of reporting facts to people through fiction?
Well, often it's been said that talking about politics is committing literary suicide. But I think the real suicide would be to not be conscious of your place in a larger context of history. And for me, and other writers who are like me, writing about a place that people don't know much about, I do feel an immense responsibility to be conscious of the weight of that responsibility. So when Philip was talking earlier about the little anecdote about the child, and we were talking about whether, you read something and it sounds true. It sounds true to certain readers based on their own experience. But if their own experience has not included any of those events that have happened, then it's cultural. So what I put down on paper is being responded to based upon your cultural experience, not mine. So my efforts in writing have to be doubled to make sure that I'm actually allowing you to experience what I have experienced, but also then access the emotional truth of what I'm saying. I mean, people who don't read Mother Jones or the UK Guardian or Slate are still reading fiction. And sometimes, there's like Jim Croce, I think, was saying yesterday that there's only a limited number of books that you're going to read. And if you're only going to pick up one book on Sri Lanka in the entirety of your life and you know nothing about Sri Lanka, then that book becomes your portal into understanding an entire nation. And so for me, I take that very seriously. And so I can't just put in things that I've read in a newspaper and think, oh, this is a cool sounding, terrible atrocity I'm going to put into my book now because I'm sure people are going to be outraged and say, oh my God, those crazy, brown Sri Lankans, they run around, hacking each other to death. I have to really look at something that brings you in and allows you to see the emotional truth of the country that I come from. And because it's not just On Salma Lane, is not just Ru Freeman's book, it is also the story of my country and my people, and that is a far bigger story than me.
One of the strange things I've found is that the way novelists feel about truth, is that there's an interesting difference between literary fiction and mass market fiction. One of the really strange things I often notice in airport thrillers is that the writers of those books are strangely obsessed with getting facts right. So if you read Dan Brown, it will literally say, I went into the Louvre, I walked down the 73 steps onto the oak parquet floor. And he's gone there with a notebook and written it down. And then he'll say, and then I jumped out of the window with the Holy Grail in my pocket. So, it's absolute nonsense. But he thinks, I'll put in some facts, and it will make it seem more real.
Dan Brown, he's always telling you what square foot some building or other is.
It's filled with facts.
Do you know why?
Why is he putting those in?
Because most of the prose he's read in the last 20 years has been written by real estate brokers.
But it's a common thing. I remember reading an interview with, I can't remember what thriller writer, saying that if I write a book where someone gets off at Geneva Airport and hires a car, I have to go to Geneva Airport and find out where the car hire stall is and get it right that it's in the same terminal. And I think, but writers of literary fiction don't care. You put it where you want to put it. It doesn't matter.
I don't know. I mean, there are lots of writers who write about airports in detail. John Updike, will write about what it's like to drive to Miami, to Fort Lauderdale from Miami Airport in great detail. I think it is possible. I think that, there's lots of. But I know exactly what you mean about the sort of novels, which are thrillers, but usually most of them about how air traffic control works, and but I'm not. I just feel that There's absolutely no rule of thumb here. There's no sort of there's no sort of secret truth that we're going to sort of talk a conclusion we're going to come to. I just think it's much more mysterious what makes a book compelling. It's just much more mysterious in the relationship of the book to kind of the world of facts. And I do think that thrillers do have their own. I think you put your finger on it when you said there's the, very, very detailed description of, of the square footage and what curtains were there and, what the guards' uniforms were like, irrelevant sort of detail. And then there's the Holy Grail. I mean, it's because there's sort of, you kind of create a sort of this atmosphere of truth for these other, and psychologically implausible characters as well, with no inner life and sort of, no sort of family connections usually, and they just sort of wander around having adventures.
And we've strayed off. The one thing in this topic that we've strayed off slightly and forgotten is the question of autobiographical fiction. And I'm wondering, would any of you hold your hand up and say, yes, I have written an autobiographical novel? Or do you think that's something people are shy of? And if none of you have, then maybe there are people who have overtly have. Edward St. Aubyn is an example of someone who has very clearly done that.
I've written 2 autobiographical novels, actually. One was my autobiography, and one was somebody else's autobiography. And I thought that was a nice. It was. I don't know whether I didn't quite invent it. I mean, Gertrude Stein wrote the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and my novel, my last novel, Scenes from Early Life, it came about because. My husband's a brilliant sort of verbal storyteller, but he's never going to write a book, I hope. So, and he kept saying, I should write a book, I should write a book. My story is much more interesting than most of all this. And then would tell me funny stories about his aunts and and what his family got up to in the 70s. And finally, I got so fed up of listening to this that I said, okay, I'm going to write your autobiographical novel. And so it's his autobiography. He had nothing to do with it beyond telling me the stories. But that was a much nicer way to write an autobiographical novel, to take on somebody else's autobiography. I don't know why people don't do that more.
That's a biographical novel,
No, it's not, because he's telling it. It's in the first person. I think it's an autobiography.
Ghost-written, or sort of.
If the word ghostwriter wasn't such an awful insult, William.
But it has
anyway,
I'm not the ghost's name on it rather than the
I tell you why it's not ghost-written, because he didn't pay me.
And the rest of you, the other 3 of you, would you confess to having written an autobiographical novel, or do you think that's a dirty word that you wouldn't want to be associated with?
I believe that all fiction is non-fiction in the end anyway, so I think that whether you are acknowledging it or not, most of us are drawing on autobiographical facts, so even whether it's a conversation you've heard and you're hearing somebody else's story, it's still part of your hearing process that is going in there. And but I think the trick to it is to try to write it in a way that the people that you're writing about recognize elements that they are familiar with, but they don't identify it with themselves. So, for instance, in A Disobedient Girl, my first novel, there's an older woman who's leaving an abusive husband and taking her 3 children with her. And it is based largely on my own mother. Certainly not the circumstances, but here she is. She had 3 children. She had a terrible marriage. And she would have liked to leave. And it was basically thinking aloud in fiction what would happen if she had actually left. But when she read the book, she said to me, there are lots of things that remind me of myself. I don't know whether you realized. And I'm thinking, well, yes, because that's you. But she didn't really know that was her. And the other example that comes to mind is Justin Torres's book, We the Animals, which is an incredible, very short novel. And he's writing about growing up with his 2 brothers. And much of it is autobiographical, but it is sold as a novel. And the hilarious thing is that his brothers were sitting around discussing the book with him and saying, yeah, remember when that happened? And he's thinking to himself, that didn't happen. I made that up. But he made it up so authentically that they believed it had actually happened to them.
But there's a real difficulty, I think, in writing autobiographical fiction about family.
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is you start from something real, and then you divert into what-ifs. I think that as a writer, you get yourself into very difficult territory with that, because people will assume that it's your family, and then your family will resent that departure, because other people will read it and will think your mother or your brother did this or that or the other. Do you think that writers get into terrible personal difficulties with that territory?
Well, I mean, my father's response was, there was one line about some policy that had been passed during the course of this book, and he read the whole book, and his one note was, you know, I was responsible for passing that policy. And I was thinking, but this book is not about you. So I think the difficulty is not so much that other people will think that it's about your family and judge them harshly, but that they themselves think you are judging them harshly.
Well, it's interesting. I was at Jonathan Franson's event a couple of days ago, and he said a very interesting thing. He said, when I was a younger writer, I wrote about myself more, and then I found, he said he was trying to write about himself, and he found it didn't work because he never liked the character on the page, which I thought was very interesting, and then he had to move on to other things. Either he was too hard on himself and too soft on himself. And I feel like as a writer, you can be hard on yourself on the page, but when it comes to family, you're putting your family in a very difficult position if you're being hard on your parents or siblings.
But if you're writing fiction, don't you just say it's not you? I mean, I wrote a family history in a non-fiction. I actually looked at the story of my two grandfathers. I have my Irish grandfather and my Turkish grandfather, who were both imprisoned during the Second World War, and in very mysterious circumstances, and they were not spoken of in the family at all. And I decided to look into those two stories, and I wrote this book about it. And so it was a very detailed book about them, and it also became a book about my parents and their relationship to their fathers, and all sorts of things, political, violence, etc. And I was, of course, very nervous writing it. I was worried about how the family would react, and they reacted they were fine about it. I think, and the thing is, I've spoken to other people who've written about their family, and they all say, you can't predict what your family will be upset about. And there's always something they're going to be upset about, and you just can't predict it. In my case, my family just, received the book with a sort of deathly silence. And so, which is pretty good, really, all things considered. And but I remember, there was Peter Godwin, who was up here yesterday, and who's doing various events. He wrote this fantastic memoir of growing up in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it then was, called Memoir, which had all sorts of stuff in it, which was potentially, tricky. And the one thing he said, I remember him telling me years ago, he was amazed that the thing that upset his mother was that he had said, in passing, I went to this school and I was quite unhappy at this school. And so after everything the mother said to him, really? You were unhappy at school? And he'd never seen that coming. And I was wondering if Ved, who's obviously the maestro here of this sort of writing, how you think about the feelings of others when you write about your family, etc., etc.
I think it's no different than thinking of feelings of other people when you're writing about them. Just because a person is a family member doesn't make him more sacred piece of writing. I think it's very important to be respectful of everyone you write about, just so that you get at the truth of their real place in the world. It's fine to invent. In fact, it's wonderful to invent, but it should be done within limits. And in my view, the limits are plausibility, factual accuracy. A book about Oxford can't be set at Yale. It wouldn't ring true. So I think it's very important to decide, for the writer to decide where the book is going to be set and what the purpose of the book is. I don't think these are just airy-fairy questions. I think they are real concerns that writers have. Anyway.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was a fascinating session. We've got about a few minutes left for some questions. Are there any questions?
There's a question right here at the front.
Oh, yeah, okay. First question down here.
Good morning. I wonder if any of your panelists could shed some light on ways of structuring autobiographies beyond the obvious linear start-to-finish structure. What other structures have they explored or could they talk about?
Does anyone want to pick that up? Maybe, Ved, do you have an answer to that question?
I think autobiography has no limits in its structure. It's like any piece of writing. You can structure it any way you like. It can be reminiscence, it can be chronological, it can be linear. I think that a piece of writing is a piece of writing. You're under no constraints to do one kind of writing because you're writing autobiography. The only thing I'm concerned when I read something is not how it's structured, but whether it rings true or not, whether it's plausible or not, whether the writer has taken care to make the narrative factually correct. I don't want to read a book about the New Yorker where actually the writer is describing New York Magazine and not describing the New Yorker at all. So I think, to me, structure only has place in making the narrative plausible.
Do we have another question? Do we have another question from the audience? Yeah, there's a lady here with a colourful scarf, colourful shawl.
This question is mainly to Ru or Rooney, but I'd like to contextualize it in a broad intellectual issue. You know, when you talk of race and you talk of conflict situations based on race, there's the intellectual idea of imagined community. And quite often when you write, you're trying to reimagine community and put perspective with some kind of value judgment on it. So if you have a Michael Ondaatje, for example, Running in the Family, he's writing about a Burgher community in Sri Lanka, and anyone in the English-speaking milieu of a certain age would be able to understand, and it would resonate with them.
So what's the question there?
It's about imagined community and race, and writing about race or conflict situation. So if you were a Sinhalese, or you were a Tamil, or you were English-speaking middle-class milieu, the perspectives would be different. So there would be multiple truths. But if you were just writing about a period, and that's why I brought up Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family, you're writing about a community which is not really about that. You're just writing about an era and a community which is not really infringing on race. Then you could perhaps have one truth and we could all relate to it.
Okay, thank you. Ru, do you have a response to that? Imagined communities.
Yeah, imagined communities. So I think the difficulty I can only speak about me, and I am Sinhalese, and writing about the communities that I'm imagining in this particular book. One of the most difficult things for me to write was the perspective of the Tamil communities, because that isn't my community. But that also was the most interesting and exciting part and most creative part for me in writing the book too, because I really had to imagine myself into that perspective, into those shoes. How would these events seem to someone who isn't Sinhalese? So that, I guess, kind of.
Do we have another question? Yeah, the gentleman there standing up towards the back.
Good morning. Sir, my question is a very simple one. If you write a piece of fiction which is based on real life facts, part of which is real, a part of which is made up by me, and then your editor tells you, remove the portion which is taken from your real life, is not plausible. How should I react? the portion which is real sounds fiction, and the part which has been made up by me sounds real. How should I react to my editor's query?
Do you have a response to that? I think it's a question of plausibility.
Be specific. Tell us about the brand, the make of car. Tell us about the exact recipe for what they eat in the evening. I think the job of the writer is to blur that distinction between what really happened in the real world, whatever the real world is, and the thing that's just come out of his head, really. And the way that you can do that is to focus on specific details.
I think we've got time for one last question. Yeah, the gentleman there. Okay. There's somebody there with a hat on and a red scarf.
We'll have to keep this very brief, this question. Please be succinct.
I'll be absolutely brief. Just wanted to say, newer forms of writing like blogging, don't they sort of also come into the territory of autobiography and things like that? And what do you have to say about that?
Joseph, do you want to take that question?
Blogging. Well, blogging, like everything else, could be what you make of it. You could be the next Tolstoy and do it in the blog form. It just depends what you intend to do with your blog. I do think that in theory there's no reason why deathless prose could not be written in a blog. There's absolutely no reason why that couldn't happen.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you all to the panel very much.
Thank you, Ru Freeman, Ved Mehta, Joseph O'Neill, Philip Hensher, and William Sutcliffe. This session was presented by Rajasthan Patrika.